Welcome back to the deep dive. We've all been busy scrubbing the last year of cinema off our memory drives, and honestly, I feel like I just crawled out of a swamp.
A very specific kind of swamp.
A swamp filled with blood, corporate anxiety, and surprisingly genuine creative brilliance. Today, we're looking back at the cinematic calendar of 2025.
And it wasn't just another year.
No, this wasn't just a year. It was a structural collapse followed by, an explosive rebirth. And we've compiled the sources, the box office data, the critical reviews, the internal studio notes to really understand what happened.
It wasn't a continuation of the trends we've tracked for the last, 5, 6 years? That's the crucial finding in all our source material. What we witnessed was a violent rupture in the industry.
A violent rupture. That's a strong term.
It is. The audience didn't just passively tune out, they actively rejected the dominant paradigm. The fatigue wasn't a slow drift. It was a sudden, sharp, and for some studios, very profitable pivot.
Critics and analysts have already coined the phrase, and it's stuck. 2025 was the year of the wolf. But I want to challenge that metaphor right away.
Okay.
I appreciate the idea of a certain, primal, dangerous hunger, but wasn't this really just the studios panic releasing everything they had shelved post-strike? Is violent rupture maybe too generous for what might just be a sharp market correction?
That's a fair challenge, but I think the wolf metaphor holds up because it speaks to one thing: necessity.
Necessity.
Exactly. The industry had spent years relying on sanitized, reliably returning franchise IP, the mega-budget sequels designed to hit those global box office targets.
The sheep.
They were the sheep of the pasture, yes. Easy to manage, predictable. But in 2025, those reliable returns just vanished. We saw catastrophic financial failures in the most reliable IPs. The industry was suddenly starved.
So it's not just a correction, it's a famine.
It's a famine. You're facing massive streaming losses, rising production inflation, and an audience that simply stopped showing up for what felt like homework.
So the wolf is the studio, desperate for sustenance, and it's forced to hunt in new, dangerous, and much riskier territories.
Precisely. To find revenue, the studios had to venture into the wild. Auteur-driven risk, high-concept original horror, and searing existential satire. It was a scramble for survival that weirdly paid off creatively.
You're talking about the death of what we've long called the content slurry, that endless, interconnected universe chapter approach designed more to please shareholders and fill streaming queues than to provide a single, compelling theatrical experience.
That finally ground to a screeching halt. The audience canceled the homework assignment.
And what replaced that slurry?
A cinema defined by flesh, blood, and the terrifying resurgence of the specific. Films were no longer about connecting dots to the next installment or setting up post-credit scenes.
Right.
They were about delivering a singular, complete, and often deeply unsettling experience. This shift didn't just happen. It was aggressively demanded by box office receipts.
And that's what we're deep diving into today. Our sources have meticulously mapped out this revolutionary year, and we see four major pillars that defined this historical pivot.
The proof that the wolf was hungry.
Exactly. We'll be unpacking the commercial dominance of original horror, the intellectual punch of existential sci-fi, which really became the new genre for socioeconomic critique, the weaponization of legacy trauma and revivals, and of course we have to settle the great debate. Is the superhero fundamentally dead? Or did 2025 just kill the bad superhero?
It's the essential question because the data presents a truly fascinating paradox. The old gods fell, but one new deity did manage to rise from the ashes.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the biggest shock of the year. The monster finally eclipsed the man in the cape, becoming the new economic backbone of the entire industry.
Yeah.
For the better part of a decade, the definition of a successful blockbuster rested almost entirely on IP adherence.
Right, it was the only game in town.
But if 2025 proved anything, it's that the monster is back, and frankly, it's more compelling because it's allowed to be messy, specific, and dangerous.
And the sources make a critical distinction here. This wasn't the elevated horror that critics loved back in the 2010s.
No slow burn grief metaphors, no quiet atmospheric dread.
None of that. This horror was kinetic, it was loud, it was physical and politically incendiary. It was designed to punch you in the face.
And it worked.
Absolutely. The success of films like Sinners and, on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, The Monkey, fundamentally changed the entire studio calculus.
How so?
They demonstrated that the most valuable property in Hollywood wasn't an established comic book character with decades of baggage,
But a director.
but a director with a singular, terrifying vision. The audience wasn't looking for safety or comfort. They were looking for a high-stakes theatrical event that delivered a visceral jolt.
And it's important to understand the stakes studios were placing on these projects. This ties right back to your Wolf thesis.
It does.
When your $250 million sequels are underperforming, suddenly a $60 million horror film from a director like Ryan Coogler starts to look like the safest financial bet on the table.
It's an insane reversal, but that's where we were.
So let's talk about that one first.
The watershed moment for this shift came with the April release of Ryan Coogler's Sinners. This film didn't just succeed, it single-handedly validated the blockbuster auteur theory.
Which is the idea that the director's vision is the brand.
The brand is the director, not the monster. It told studios, unequivocally.
Yeah.
Yes, high-budget original IP is a risk, but when a director's vision is the primary selling point, the audience will show up.
And they showed up in droves.
They did. Sinners wasn't just a financial success, it was a cultural phenomenon. It was this magnificent reclamation of the Southern Gothic tradition, executed with ferocious originality and specificity.
What made it so original, I think, beyond the 1932 Mississippi Delta setting, was its thematic engine. It was all built around Michael B. Jordan's mesmerizing dual performance.
As the twin brothers, smoke and stack.
And this wasn't just a technical novelty, right? It was the whole narrative mechanism for exploring the fractured self within the Black experience in the Jim Crow South.
And that meticulous character construction proves the studio invested heavily in character specificity over just, generic spectacle.
Yeah.
Tell us more about the visual language they used to differentiate the two.
The sources detail the intense effort placed on the visual coding. Smoke, for instance, he is frequently dressed in cool blues and muted colors.
Right.
He represents that repressed trauma, the brother who carries the severe internalized weight of their past, including, his time working for Al Capone. He's the serious, calculating counterpart, striving for respectability.
But then you have Stack.
And then you have Stack, draped in bold, eye-catching reds and vibrant patterns. He is the charismatic showman, the unrestrained id. He embodies this dangerous visibility, the desire for pure, immediate release, pleasure, and wealth in a world that denies him all three.
So they come back to the Delta to open a juke joint.
A literal safe space for Black joy, shielded from systemic racism and the Klan. But Coogler brilliantly subverts those period drama expectations by making the supernatural threat completely inseparable from the racial violence of the setting.
And this is where the critical analysis gets incredibly sharp. The vampire as an assimilation metaphor. The vampires in Sinners are not traditional movie monsters.
No, not at all.
They are agents of consumption and cultural colonization. The 1932 setting allows Coogler to draw a direct line between the extractive Jim Crow economy, which sought to drain labor and resources from Black communities, and the literal extractive nature of the vampire.
They don't just kill, they colonize the cultural lifeblood of the Delta blues tradition.
Exactly. They are the ultimate expression of insidious cultural imposition. They want the music, the culture, the joy, not just the blood.
And what cemented that analytical success was the brilliant, jarring use of sound and music. The sources all highlight the famous final freakout scene, you remember this, with the 3 white vampires who suddenly start singing traditional Irish folk songs.
It's so unsettling.
It's this surrealist, jarring sonic warning. It's the imposition of one set of cultural traditions violently clashing with the blues music that, throughout the entire film, acts as a protective spell.
The music isn't ambiance. It's narrative armor.
That's a great way to put it.
The score, brimming with authentic Delta blues, functions as the counterspell against the evil trying to consume that cultural space. It's not just background noise, it's active defense.
That's the core of the critical analysis. But let's focus on the scene that, it launched 1,000 Reddit threads and video essays. The famous Preacher Boy sequence.
With Sammy, played by Miles Caton.
Yes. Why did this specific, deeply localized moment become the defining image of 2025's cinema?
Because it represents the absolute triumph of original horror through specificity.
Okay.
Sammy, the preacher's son and a blues guitarist, he faces down this monstrous threat, and he uses his music, specifically his blues guitar, as his defense. Not a silver bullet, not a stake.
Just his guitar.
Just the music. That choice is too specific, too culturally rooted, and too narratively unconventional for any focus-grouped franchise film. It required a studio to trust a single director's instinct. It's that reliance on unique cultural history, on the resilience found only in the blues, that makes the scene resonate globally.
It was a moment that said, This story is anchored to this place, this time, and these people.
And it can't be replicated.
Speaking of massive swings, the film wasn't immune to critique, was it? Coogler has been previously critiqued for reaching for epic scope, and some reviewers felt Sinners was structurally ambitious to a fault.
Yes, the primary critique, which is often the critique of a true auteur,
Yeah.
was that he sometimes reaches for epic scope when intimacy would do just fine.
What does that mean in this context?
The film accumulated characters and backstories very rapidly. The pacing felt, to some, overstuffed with historical and social context before we even got to the central action in the juke joint.
But the consensus was that it worked.
The consensus was clear. This narrative messiness was a sin worth forgiving. It was a massive $80 million ambitious project delivered within the studio system. It proved that audiences will enthusiastically reward ambition over safe, clean, predictable delivery.
The wolf wanted the blood, not the filtered water.
Exactly.
So if Sinners was the prestige socio-political horror that took the massive swing, Osgood Perkins as the monkey represented the other side of the 2025 horror success story.
The viral, snarky commercial behemoth.
Yes. After a year defined by intense, heavy, emotionally draining horror, The Monkey was the film that allowed audiences to scream, laugh, and meme all at once.
And it was a conscious, definitive pivot away from the elevated horror trend that had dominated the mid-2010s.
It was almost a rebellion against it.
It was. The Monkey leaned fully into its campy, almost absurd premise, a cursed toy monkey clapping cymbals that causes these gruesome, often darkly comical deaths, and it brought back the idea of fun horror.
The audience in 2025 wasn't just looking for deep metaphors about grief.
No, they also wanted the visceral jolt of a jump scare, combined with cynical, self-aware humor. They wanted to have fun being scared again.
And its success, pulling in a surprising 69 million worldwide, was a masterclass in modern marketing.
Oh, absolutely. It bypassed traditional ads almost entirely and just leveraged the platform economy. The film wasn't just promoted, it was turned into a participatory event.
That's the core insight here, right? The marketing campaign used incredibly clever viral strategies.
They didn't just run trailers. They collaborated with platforms like TikTok to create bespoke profile frames and interactive ad formats. They let users overlay the ominous cursed monkey onto their own short-form content.
And the clap challenge.
The clap challenge was genius. The sound that signals inevitable death translated perfectly to short-form video. It turned the film into a digital cryptid and made promotion synonymous with a pre-existing social media trend.
And what cemented that viral success was the specific aesthetic choice to utilize the Paul Frank character, Julius the Monkey, in cross-promotions.
Which is such a weird, specific choice.
But it tapped directly into that distinct, specific nostalgia for the late 90s and early 2000s, an era that feels simultaneously comforting and corrupted to the target demographic.
It's nostalgia weaponized, but incredibly effectively so. It made the film feel instantly familiar, yet subtly dangerous.
And structurally, The Monkey reinforced that dominant thematic motif of 2025 cinema we saw in Sinners.
The dual performance.
The dual performance. With Theo James playing twin brothers Hal and Bill, once again we see the fractured self representing the different responses to childhood trauma.
So Hal is the soft-spoken brother who tries to repress the original trauma associated with the cursed object, trying to build a functional life.
Exactly.
While Bill is the brother who never moved past it, remaining trapped in the role of the childhood bully.
And the monkey is the physical manifestation of that repressed shared memory, demanding a blood toll for the attempt to forget or sanitize the past.
It's the past returning with a metallic clap.
It just shows that whether the cost is $80 million or $20 million, the most compelling horror in 2025 was about confronting rather than escaping deeply buried pain.
It's fascinating how often we see that idea. You cannot escape your past, you can only try to integrate it, or it returns as a monster.
Whether it's a vampiric system of exploitation or a clapping cymbal monkey?
It's the same fundamental fear.
Right. So if original horror showed us where the audience was placing their trust financially,
the existential sci-fi genre provided the intellectual reason why they felt so exhausted in the first place. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the contemporary socioeconomic landscape defined by gig economies, the existential fear of AI replacement, and constant corporate precarity, it needed a mirror.
A mirror that reflected the absurdity of modern labor.
And Bong Joon-ho's Mickey 17 was that mirror. A scathing, deeply melancholic critique of late-stage capitalism disguised as a high-concept space adventure.
This film had a massive, strategically sound delay. It was pushed back a full year, and that timing ended up being absolutely perfect.
It couldn't have landed at a better time.
The concept of the expendable resonated so deeply with the contemporary workforce that it moved from interesting sci-fi concept to a defining cultural meme of the year.
Yeah, it was everywhere.
For those who might have missed the details, the premise is devastatingly simple. Robert Pattinson plays Mickey Barnes, an expendable, on a colonization mission to the icy planet Niflheim.
And if Mickey dies, he's digitally photocopied reprinted, with most of his memories intact, to immediately resume his duties.
Crucially, the sources all emphasize this is not a benefit for Mickey, it's a benefit for the company.
And that's the core of Bong's brilliance. This digital photocopying resurrection process is explicitly not presented as immortality or a scientific marvel.
No.
It is fundamentally framed as a mechanism of supreme corporate exploitation. Mickey is truly expendable. A human crash test dummy whose body is just a disposable asset, a pile of flesh to be experimented upon and discarded.
He is the ultimate at-will employee.
He can't quit, he can't unionize, and he can't even achieve final release through death.
This is why the film resonated so profoundly with the burnout generation. Mickey doesn't die once. He dies repeatedly, 17 times, accumulating the physical and mental trauma of impossible labor without the psychological release of finality.
It perfectly mimics the soul-crushing nature of modern corporate life, right?
It does.
Where employees are expected to constantly reset, recover instantly, and perform perfectly, regardless of how exhausted or traumatized they were by the last cycle.
It's the constant expectation of being 100% available and perfectly productive, regardless of your mental or physical state. Your death is just an inconvenience to management.
And Bong Joon-ho, building on his incisive class critiques from Parasite and Snowpiercer, he just transports that rigid vertical hierarchy to space.
So the primary antagonists aren't the standard movie aliens.
Their management, which allows the film to engage in this brilliant, targeted satire of the corporate structure itself. The real horror isn't the frozen planet, it's the HR department.
And that satire is personified perfectly by Mark Ruffalo's character, Kenneth Marshall. The sources detail how critics immediately labeled him the Trump buffoonery avatar.
And you can see why. He's this cartoonish, idiot villain whose entire perspective is defined by treating Niflheim as a corporate asset to be exploited, not a home to be protected.
Marshall is solely obsessed with intergalactic manifest destiny.
Yes, viewing the indigenous life forms, the creepers, as simply scary creatures to be eradicated for profit and colonization.
But this is where Bong subverts the expectation for the audience.
He always does.
Mickey 17 is saved by those very indigenous creepers who are revealed to be this compassionate, symbiotic collective offering him refuge.
And that ultimately is the film's central radical political statement. It takes the class warfare metaphor into the realm of the truly alien.
The worker realizes they have more in common with the alien, the marginalized and misunderstood, than they do with their own CEO.
Who sees them only as a metric on a spreadsheet? The house in Parasite is replaced by the colony base, but the dynamic of absolute expendability and betrayal remains exactly the same.
The intensity of the exploitation also drove the film's central identity crisis, which is the basis of the plot.
Right, with Pattinson playing both Mickey 17 and Mickey 18.
The beaten-down, resigned worker and the more assertive, radicalized clone who becomes a reluctant mentor and rival to his predecessor.
And Pattinson made a polarizing, but I would argue brilliant choice here.
Yeah.
You mentioned he modeled his vocal affectations for the two Mickeys on the cartoon characters Ren and Stimpy.
I mean, that sounds insane on paper. How did critics justify that kind of wackiness in a serious critique of corporate exploitation? Wasn't that a huge risk?
It was a massive risk, but it's pure Bong Joon-ho tone blending, which often blends farce and tragedy.
Okay.
The argument is that in a system so absurdly cruel as to monetize resurrection, a system that makes death irrelevant to capital, the only truly rational response is a form of functional madness or wacky absurdity.
So his weird voice is a symptom of this system.
Exactly. Pattinson's performance suggested that the 17th iteration of this exhausted worker had fundamentally lost his grasp on stable reality, manifesting in these bizarre vocal tics.
It definitely raises the classic philosophical conundrum, the ship of Theseus paradox, but grounds it in workplace anxiety.
Yeah.
Where does the soul or identity reside when you're literally printing new versions of yourself solely for the purpose of labor?
The film suggests that the soul is eroded by the labor process itself, not the cloning. By the time we meet Mickey 17, the cumulative labor has stripped him down to this whiny-voiced, laconic pushover.
So the journey isn't about avoiding death.
No, the primary journey of the film is his desperate attempt to find the will to become a defender of the vulnerable and fight back, rather than just be another compliant copy in the assembly line of exploitation. Mickey 17 took the idea of burnout and made it globally existential.
Proving that high-concept sci-fi could deliver the intellectual weight the audience was craving. Okay, so moving from the intellectual satire of space to the gut-wrenching trauma of the past. 2025 was also defined by a specific type of legacy revival. These films didn't just reheat old IP, they explored how trauma is inherited, mutated, and weaponized over decades. And the sources highlight two massive films that nailed this theme. 28 Years Later, and Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein.
Both films used beloved, established IP to explore a common theme. The body, or in this case, the culture, keeps the score.
The past is never truly past.
It just evolves into a new, more horrifying form of danger that infects the next generation.
Let's start with 28 Years Later.
So Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, the original masterminds, they returned to the world they created back in 2002. Crucially, they skipped over the months and weeks we've already seen and landed squarely on a world 28 years later.
And this is not just a zombie flick.
No, it's a profound sociological text on societal collapse and, critically, what bizarre cultural structures grow in the ruins of civilization.
And the most divisive and fascinating element of the film proves that very point. The Jimmy's cult. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
These weren't your typical post-apocalyptic cannibals. They were feral, young warriors raised entirely on the cultural debris of a bygone era. Specifically 90s children's TV shows found on degraded VHS tapes scattered among the wreckage.
That is the tragedy of degraded history writ large, and it's essential to understanding the film's critique of nostalgia.
And they dress like Jimmy Savile, a deeply disturbing cultural reference that evokes this corrupted, dark nostalgia.
And they fight with the highly stylized, choreographed movements of the Power Rangers.
Which is just so bizarre to watch.
But the Power Rangers' fighting style isn't just a bizarre stylistic choice for an action sequence, it's the core tragedy of their existence. In the absence of true cultural context, mythology, or adult guidance, they mimic the aesthetic forms of heroism they found on old tapes.
Without understanding any of the meaning or morality behind the poses.
Exactly. Cultural debris becomes their new corrupt religion.
The structural gamble here was almost more controversial than the cult itself. You called it the Jim Gambit.
Yes, the Jim Gambit.
The term critics coined for the structural decision to actively withhold Cillian Murphy's expected return. Tell us why this was such a heated point of contention.
Well, the marketing had heavily teased Cillian Murphy's return as Jim, the protagonist from the original film. But the narrative follows a new set of characters: Spike, his parents, and the new Jimmy, who leads the cult.
And Murphy's Jim is barely referenced until the final seconds of the film.
Right. That decision caused absolute WTF reactions from the audience who felt misled. But critically, it was a deliberate, bold structural move by the filmmakers.
So it wasn't a narrative cheat, it was a psychological strategy.
Exactly. It forces the audience to feel the absence of the father figure, mirroring the new character's own deep sense of abandonment in a world that has moved on without clear heroes.
So it makes you care about the new generation's fight against the inherited chaos rather than just waiting for the icon to save the day.
It focuses on dread, decay, and the unavoidable march of time. And it perfectly sets up the confirmed sequel, The Bone Temple, where Murphy is set to return and finally confront the horrors his escape inadvertently facilitated.
On the complete aesthetic opposite end of the spectrum, we have Guillermo del Toro's long-awaited Frankenstein,
Which was a massive streaming hit.
racking up an astonishing 29 million views in its opening weekend. It proved that del Toro's unique blend of gothic horror and profound empathy translates perfectly to the home screen.
And this film sparked what critics gleefully labeled the monster sexual viral thirst phenomena surrounding Jacob Elordi's creature.
It was everywhere online.
And while it sounds superficial, this intense reaction validated del Toro's core philosophical mission, finding beauty in the grotesque. He wanted the audience to instantly feel repulsion and attraction.
The sources describe the creature as having deathly blue skin and a tattered coat, but the design intentionally preserved Elordi's brooding brown eyes and chiseled angles.
Del Toro specifically stated he didn't want a lumpy creature. He wanted a fallen angel who was physically perfect but morally compromised by his creator.
And the internet's instantaneous reaction confirmed that goal. By making the creature visually arresting, the film reconnects the audience with the psychosexual intrigue of Mary Shelley's original text.
It frames the monster not as pure objective evil, but as a victim of profound artistic and parental failure. The visual appeal forces you to confront your own definitions of humanity and monstrosity.
And that failure is emphasized by the creature's vulnerability. Unlike the eloquent, philosophical monster we often see in adaptations, Elordi's creature can only utter one single, desperate word.
Victor.
Vic.
That linguistic limitation strips away all the intellect and transforms him into this vulnerable, abandoned 6'5" toddler made from dozens of dead men.
Which emphasizes the utter horrific failure of Oscar Isaac's Victor, the creator.
Del Toro explicitly stated, this film was an expression of his feelings about the failure of the father-son relationship, making Victor's abandonment and subsequent moral cowardice the true horror, not the creature's existence.
And to modernize that deep-seated failure, the film introduces the perfect contemporary antagonist. Not a rival scientist, but a capitalist.
Heinrich Harlander, played by Christoph Waltz.
Perfect casting.
Harlander is the sleek, modernized version of the mad scientist trope. He functions as the angel investor for Victor's blasphemous experiments, representing the ultimate tech bro mentality that dominates our current era.
He funds disruption, in this case, disrupting life and death itself, without any ethical oversight or moral compass.
He's the Silicon Valley element injected into 19th century Gothic, pitching Victor as a revolutionary who simply needs capital to conquer mortality. It's a chilling update that ties the Gothic horror of forbidden creation directly to modern venture capitalism.
Suggesting that money, not science, is the ultimate corrupting force.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the industrial question that overshadowed all of 2025.
The big one. Was the industry finally done with capes, or just done with bad capes? The core argument underpinning the entire Year of the Wolf thesis is this. The audience now follows the creator, not just the brand. And this is where the market violently shifted.
This is where we need to have a spirited debate because the data is overwhelming, and I am taking the position of the prosecution.
Go for it.
The evidence is clear. The superhero genre, specifically the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it, is functionally dead as a guaranteed blockbuster engine. It no longer controls the conversation or the box office.
Okay, functionally dead. That's a strong claim.
Let's be frank. The era where the MCU seal was a guarantee of $800 million, $1 billion or more, is unequivocally over. It is now, shockingly, a mark of liability.
A liability?
The primary reason we had the Year of the Wolf, the reason studios had to greenlight Sinners and Mickey 17, is because the superhero failed to deliver its guaranteed revenue stream.
So the failures fueled the successes in other genres?
Directly. Let's look at the financial evidence provided in the source material, and let's put these numbers into brutal context. The Fantastic Four. First steps. A film meant to launch the entire next era of the MCU, introducing one of Marvel's core beloved families, was a catastrophic underperformance.
It was.
It only grossed around $521 million worldwide.
That is defined by analysts as severe IP fatigue. The audience's time and money is being actively redirected.
$521 million is not a small number in isolation, but in the context of a Marvel tentpole, it is a disaster. Phase 4 films, even the less popular ones like Eternals and Ant-Man 3, had a floor closer to $600 or $700 million globally.
And this was the Fantastic Four.
This was supposed to be the jewel in the crown. $521 million didn't crack the global top 10 list for 2025. When the budget and marketing costs are factored in, that is a massive financial failure and a betrayal of brand expectation. And it wasn't an isolated incident. The sources show the fatigue is endemic. Thunderbolts managed only $382 million. Captain America. Brave New World brought in just $415 million.
Ooh.
These numbers aren't just low, they are a massive signal flare indicating total audience fatigue. The interconnection of the universe, which used to be its greatest, most addictive strength, has become homework.
They don't want to do the homework anymore.
They don't want to watch 3 required Disney Plus shows, read 5 comics, and memorize the continuity to understand a theatrical release. The brand is no longer powerful enough to mask an assembly line product lacking singular vision. The MCU, as we knew it, is dead.
Okay. I agree with your foundational premise. The brand guarantee is gone. The era of the safe blockbuster is over, which is why the wolf had to hunt.
Right.
However, I must take the measured counterstance, acting as the defense for the genre itself. I argue that superheroes are not dead. The corporate assembly line superhero movie is dead. And there's a crucial nuance here that saves the genre from the grave.
I'm listening.
We must look at the data that supports the defense. While the three films you cited underperformed catastrophically, James Gunn's Superman was an unqualified success. It brought in $617 million and ranked solidly in the global top 10. How do you explain that success amid the surrounding fatigue and failure? If the brand is toxic, shouldn't all capes be sinking?
Well, you could argue it was simply a better film, benefiting from a fresh creative direction, but it still relies on 80-year-old IP. Why did the audience embrace this 80-year-old IP and reject the Fantastic Four?
The difference is entirely in the marketing and positioning. Superman succeeded because it was marketed specifically as an auteur take.
The Gunn factor.
It was James Gunn's highly personalized vision, a fresh start, distinct from the baggage of a dying, complicated, interconnected universe. The campaign wasn't about setting up sequels or shared universes. It was about the purity of this one director telling this one story.
So the creator replaced the IP as the draw.
The creator, whether it was Coogler for Sinners or Gunn for Superman, has fundamentally replaced the generic IP as the primary selling point. Audiences are willing to invest their time and money if they trust the person telling the story, especially if that person has a track record of personality and vision.
So the verdict is that you can still make a superhero movie, but you have to treat it like original IP, where the director is the star, and you have to aggressively communicate that it's not homework.
That's a consensus derived from the data. The audience is starving for specificity and vision. If a superhero vehicle can deliver that, a Superman that feels like a standalone artistic statement, then it has a chance.
But if it feels like corporate obligation...
If it feels like Chapter 4 of Phase 12, it will sink like a stone, regardless of how iconic the characters are. The Fantastic Four felt like corporate obligation. Superman felt like a creative mandate.
Which brings us to the shared takeaway then, the golden age of horror thesis.
The data is clear. Horror has now decisively replaced the superhero film as the economic backbone of the studio system.
Sinners proved that an R-rated, original, period-piece horror movie with a definitive political edge could perform like a prestige blockbuster, setting a new benchmark for profitability.
And The Monkey proved that low-cost, viral, campy horror could deliver a solid hit that scales globally through digital channels. The audience didn't stop wanting spectacles.
They just wanted spectacles that could bleed.
Yes, they traded the endless, weightless spectacle of CG hero fights for the gut-wrenching, specific, and impactful violence of the horror genre. The box office hierarchy of 2025 was dominated by vampires, clones, and feral children, not just men in tights.
The hunger for high-stakes, visceral filmmaking was simply diverted from the safe tentpole to the dangerous territory of the wolf.
The content slurry era taught us that intellectual property was king. 2025 taught us that singular vision is king. The IP is merely the canvas.
So stepping back, looking at the full stack of sources, the massive financial flops, the shocking success of original content, the cultural dominance of the monster, the verdict is incredibly clear. 2025 was, without hyperbole, the year of the wolf. The industry didn't collapse, despite what the doomsayers predicted after the erosion of the MCU guarantee.
Instead, it aggressively molted. The bloat of the content era that need to appease everyone, sanitize everything, and set up the next 15 projects, it fell away.
And what remained?
What remained was a leaner, meaner, and far more creatively aggressive creature underneath, one that prioritized the artistic perspective over the corporate mandate.
Think of the span we just covered. From the sun-drenched, blood-soaked Mississippi Delta of Sinners to the frozen corporate hellscape of Mickey 17. From the feral Power Rangers mimicking nostalgia of 28 years later to the heartbreaking, grotesque beauty of Frankenstein cinema rediscovered its teeth.
It stopped trying to save the world,
It did.
which had become an impossible, tiresome task after years of universe building that failed to resonate. Instead, it started trying to understand why the world was worth saving in the first place.
By focusing on the pain.
The pain, the injustice, the psychological absurdity, and the complexity of the human and monstrous condition.
So after analyzing the rupture, the shifts, and the resulting triumphs, we can state our final consensus. 2025 was the best year for cinema since 1999.
I'm with you on that, 100%.
It gave us risk, it gave us blood, and it gave us complexity.
And the audience has made it perfectly clear that they don't want to be placated or offered a comfortable viewing experience. They want to be challenged, disgusted, and genuinely bitten. And that raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over as we head into the new year.
Okay.
When we talked about Sinners, We discussed the concept of the safe space, the juke joint, and how the film subverted it, revealing that the sanctuary was just as vulnerable to invasion as the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
Now that audiences have shown they want that kind of challenge, what kind of dangerous story will they demand next? And critically, how much specific cultural or narrative homework are we willing to do for that experience, knowing that 2025 showed us the massive reward of true originality and specificity?
The wolf is out there, and we're excited to see what it hunts next. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.